Hey everyone, tonight we are going back. We have got a morning inside a 1960s department store where the escalators hummed like promises and a woman could spend an entire Tuesday navigating a social landscape disguised as a shopping trip, complete with its own hierarchy, its own geography, and its own unwritten rules that everyone somehow already knew. We have got the story of how Estee Lauder, the daughter of immigrants in Queens, built an empire not by inventing a better cream, but by understanding something no one had yet said out loud, that women did not simply want a product, they wanted to be treated as if their faces were worth someone's serious attention. We have got a full day in the life of a department store salesgirl, which sounds like a pleasant way to spend your working hours until you remember that pleasant and 9 hours on marble floors have very little to do with each other, and that the smile required of a saleswoman in 1963 was a specific kind of professional tool, refined over months, and maintaining it until 5 o'clock was genuinely skilled work. And we have got a look behind the gleaming official image of the post-war American department store, at the rules and the pressures and the carefully maintained fictions that the polished window displays and the bright cosmetics lighting were specifically designed to keep you from examining too closely. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here. And leave me a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up, and let us go back together. The smell hits you first. It always does. You push through the heavy glass door of the department store and the air changes completely. The way air always changes when you step from one world into another. Outside it was October, ordinary and faintly damp, carrying the smell of bus exhaust and someone's fallen leaves, and the particular sourness of a city that has been inhabited a long time by people who are managing as well as they can. Inside it is something else entirely. Inside, the air is warm and close and layered with perfume in a way that has no real-world equivalent, because the perfume here is not one perfume but a dozen of them fighting politely for territory. Chanel No. 5 near the main entrance, as always, placed there because the company pays a premium for that position, and because the store has calculated that a first impression of Chanel No. 5 says something about the entire building that nothing else quite manages. L'air du Temps a few counters over, its softer, powdery floral drifting on the air conditioning like something that was not trying very hard, which was part of its appeal, something heavier and more musky from the direction of the Revlon display. And underneath all of it, the smell of new fabric and carpet cleaner and something metallic that might be the escalator machinery, or might be the dry warmth of forced air, or might simply be the smell of organized desire, which is what a department store really is, when you take a step back and think about it honestly. You stand just inside the entrance for a moment, adjusting. Your coat is still buttoned. Your pocketbook is hooked over your forearm in the exact position your mother taught you, elbows slightly bent, bag resting against your hip, which is also the position the etiquette books recommend. And you know that your mother and the etiquette books are not independent sources on this point, but that does not make the position wrong. You have a list. Not a long list, but a real one, written on the back of an envelope in your own handwriting with the pen from the kitchen drawer. A spool of thread in a specific shade of blue, the blue of a skirt you're mending that has been sitting in the sewing basket for 2 weeks waiting for you to get to the fabric store, which you have not done because the fabric store requires parking and this store you can reach on the bus. A birthday card for your sister-in-law, who has a birthday on the 17th and whose card should have been bought 2 weeks ago and has not been, for reasons that seemed sufficient at the time and are now simply facts you are correcting. Possibly something for yourself which you have not written down because writing it down would make it an intention, and intentions can be evaluated, and this particular one does not want to be evaluated, it wants to browse. The floor is marble, or something that looks like marble, pale with grey veining, polished to a shine that reflects the overhead lights in long soft streaks. The building was renovated in the early 1950s, and the marble, or the marble look tile that costs a fraction of real marble and behaves identically underfoot, was part of that renovation, part of the deliberate decision to make the ground floor feel permanent and serious, to feel as if the institution occupying this building had been here a long time and intended to remain. Your heels click on it with a sound that is more satisfying than it has any right to be. The ceiling is high, the light is bright in a way that is somehow also flattering, and this is not accidental. The stores have worked out through years of adjustment and observation how to light their floors so that everything looks a little better than it does in ordinary light, which is the first and most fundamental trick of the department store, making the world inside the doors feel more real and more possible than the world you came from. You do not go directly to notions for the thread because no one does. No sensible woman with 2 hours and a bus pass goes directly to notions on a Tuesday morning in October. Going directly to what you need is a form of efficiency that has no place here. This is not a hardware store, not a pharmacy, not a place where the contract between you and the building is simply to acquire a thing and leave. A department store is a place you inhabit for a while. You move through it. You look at things you will not buy and things you might buy and things you cannot afford, and somewhere in the movement between those categories the morning arranges itself into something that feels almost like pleasure. It is pleasure actually, though you might not use that word for something so practical. But pleasure is what it is. The specific pleasure of moving through a world that has been arranged for your consideration, that has been stocked with things you might want and lit to show them at their best, that does not ask you to justify your presence simply by walking in the door. You start at the cosmetics counters because you always start at the cosmetics counters, and you are not alone in this. There is a gravitational quality to them. Low glass cases running most of the length of the first floor in long glittering rows, their contents precisely arranged, each product at exactly the same angle as every other product in its category, the lipstick testers standing in their little silver holders, like small glossy soldiers at attention. The women behind the counters are wearing white coats, which gives them a clinical authority that seems deliberate, as if beauty were a medical science and they the practitioners, and you should no more question their recommendations than you would question a physician's, though of course the physician is not trying to sell you something, or at least is not supposed to be. Their faces are made up with a care and precision that functions as advertisement and credentials simultaneously. Their foundation is smooth, and their colour is appropriate, and their brows are drawn with a steady hand, and they smell expensive without smelling like they are trying to, which is the ideal result of any perfume correctly applied. You slow down at the Helena Rubinstein counter without quite meaning to. There is a new moisturiser displayed on a small card easel, the kind of card that is printed to look like a personal recommendation, handwritten almost, a touch of warmth imposed on what is clearly a commercial message. The copy says something about pores and radiance, two words that exist in a specific gravitational field in women's beauty advertising, words that have been worked on by copywriters in New York offices to produce exactly the response of mild concern followed by mild optimism that they are producing in you right now. You look at your face in the small mirror mounted beside the display, a habit so automatic you no longer notice you are doing it. The mirror is round and has a slightly magnifying quality on one side, which you know from experience is there to show you things about your skin you might not notice in an ordinary mirror, which is a technique that could charitably be called educational and might less charitably be called something else. You look at your face looks back, you move on. The route you take through the first floor is not random. There is a logic to it that has been developed over years of shopping in this and other stores, an internal map that matches your pace to the layout, that knows to slow down at the glove counter, because good gloves are worth serious consideration, and to move quickly past the jewellery near the back because the costume jewellery here is not as good as the jewellery at the store across the street, and you have been told this by women whose opinions you trust, and your own observation over years of comparison has confirmed it. You carry this map the way you carry most of the rules of your adult life, without consciously thinking of them, but with a fluency that comes from long practice and is indistinguishable from instinct. The glove counter stops you properly. Gloves matter in 1963 in a way that will seem puzzling to anyone who was not there, and that was beginning, even in 1963, to seem slightly less certain than it had the decade before. The rules around gloves were loosening, very slowly at the edges, in the way that social rules in this particular era were loosening very slowly and at the edges, just enough to make the young women who were not wearing gloves feel like they were making a statement, and the older women who were wearing them feel like they were maintaining a standard. The length tells you something about the occasion for which they were purchased. Short gloves, stopping at the wrist, are appropriate for shopping and church and daytime social occasions. Longer gloves, running past the wrist and toward the elbow, are for evenings and formal events and occasions where the additional coverage signals that you understood the stakes of the gathering. Kid leather is the correct material for anything that matters. White cotton is correct for summer, for garden parties, for the kind of warm weather occasion where you want to demonstrate care without the weight of formality. There is a pair of grey kidskin gloves in the case that you pick up and try on over the counter without being invited to, which is the prerogative of a confident shopper who knows how things are done here. The saleswoman behind the counter straightens slightly without saying anything, which is a very specific kind of professional readiness. The posture that says I see you, and I am prepared to assist without saying either of those things aloud, because a good saleswoman at this kind of counter does not rush a customer who is still in the trying on phase. The gloves fit beautifully, which is the problem with them, because things that fit beautifully have a persuasive quality that is not rational but is real. The leather is soft in a way that communicates quality without announcing it. The grey is exactly the right grey, not the blue grey that veers toward navy in certain lights, but a warm neutral grey that would work with nearly everything in your existing wardrobe. The price tag reads $2.75, which is not nothing, which is almost $3, which is the price of enough ground beef for 2 dinners and a lunch. You think about this for 30 seconds, which is how long it takes you to process a moderate expenditure at a counter. You put the gloves down, you note their exact position in the case, which tray, which side, how far from the end, so you can return to them precisely if you decide to come back. You might come back, you might not. You hold both possibilities lightly. You take the escalator to the second floor, which requires a specific posture that you have never been taught explicitly, but that you have absorbed from watching other women on escalators since you were old enough to accompany your mother downtown. The slight lift at the chin. The pocketbook shifted to the crook of the arm rather than hanging. The stillness of someone who's being carried and allowing it gracefully, as if the escalator were a convenience you had granted permission to assist you, rather than a machine you're depending on to get you up 12 feet. The escalator was installed when this store was renovated, and it was considered a modernization of real significance. Before that, there were elevators, which had operators, young men in uniform who called the floors as the car stopped, Floor 2, Mrs. Ladies and children's clothing, whose existence lent a formality to the movement between levels that the escalator replaced with something more democratic and also more impersonal. The elevator said, "Where would you like to go?" and waited for your answer. The escalator says everyone goes up, at the same pace, together, which is either a leveling or simply a different kind of efficiency depending on your perspective. The second floor is women's clothing, which is where you were going before the gloves distracted you, which is how October Tuesday department store mornings go. The dresses are arranged by style, and then by size within style, and finding your way through requires first identifying the correct category, day dresses as opposed to cocktail, wool and wool blends as opposed to the full cottons that are too light for November on, and then finding your size within that category, which is never exactly where logic would suggest. The saleswomen have arranged things according to the store's internal system, which is not the same as any customer's internal system, and the first 5 minutes of shopping in clothing is always a kind of translation exercise between your understanding of what you want and the store's understanding of what it has. Day dresses in October in a mid-sized city means wool and wool blends, plaids and solids, the particular palette of the season, which the buyers have coordinated to run toward rust and forest green and burgundy, and a grey-brown that the hang tag calls mushroom, which is the kind of word that makes a colour sound like a considered choice rather than a default. The tags also carry the name of the manufacturer, information that matters to you in the way that brand information mattered to women of this era, who had learned through experience which manufacturers cut their patterns generously, and which skimped, which fabric suppliers produced wool that held its shape after dry cleaning, and which produced wool that emerged from the cleaner with a subtle but irreversible droop. This knowledge is not available in any published form. It is transmitted directly between women, through comments at bridge tables and in beauty parlour chairs and in the break room at work, an oral tradition of consumer information so specific and so practically useful that it amounts, over a lifetime, to a real education in the quality of things. You sort through the rack with a practiced hand, your fingers barely pausing on anything that does not meet several criteria simultaneously. The criteria are firm and not written anywhere. The colour must work with what you already have, because a dress in a colour that requires new shoes and a new handbag and possibly a new coat is not a $14.95 dress. It is a $50 commitment dressed up as a moderate purchase, and you have made this mistake and do not plan to make it again. The cut must not require significant alterations because alterations cost money and time, and Mrs. Barone, who does the alterations on your street, is booked into December, and anything requiring her until then is a dress you will not be wearing to your neighbour's anniversary dinner in November. The fabric must be of a weight and quality that will survive actual wearing. This last criterion is the most important and the most difficult to assess quickly, because the mass production of the post-war era has produced an enormous number of garments that look correct on the hanger and feel diminished on the body after the second wearing, and the only way to avoid them is to know what you're touching. You check seams, you look at the lining or the absence of one. You rub the fabric between your fingers in a way that was taught to you by watching your mother shop, who had in turn watched her mother, who had in turn watched hers, a technique passing directly from women to women without being named or written down, simply demonstrated and absorbed the way a great many genuinely useful things are transmitted through this particular culture. A dress that photographs well but is cheaply made is the department store equivalent of a social lie, pleasant to encounter and ultimately not worth your time. There is a dress in the back of the rack, pushed behind two others in a similar weight, but an unfortunate shade of orange that has been there long enough to have been passed over by several women before you. When you find it, you hold it out and look at it for a longer moment than you have given anything else this morning. Wool crepe in a deep navy, not bright, not purple navy, but true navy. The colour of evening before the dark is fully committed. The colour of the hour between sunset and night that painters sometimes try to capture, and that most people simply experience as a particular quality of sadness mixed with beauty that does not need a name. The collar is a simple Peter Pan, which is perhaps a degree more girlish than you strictly prefer, but the seams are finished with a precision that speaks well of the manufacturer, double-stitched on the inside, flat and even, not puckered at the curve. The cut at the waist is generous in a way that says the pattern was drafted for a real body, rather than for the idealised figure in the pattern catalogue. Real women have ribs. Real women breathe. This dress was made by someone who had noticed. The price tag reads $14.95, which is above what you intended to spend. Intending to spend a certain amount in a department store and actually spending that amount are related but not identical activities, and you have enough experience with both to know that the relationship between them is negotiable. But $14.95 is a real number, a number that requires thought. You hang the dress over your arm. This is not a commitment. Hanging it over your arm means you are considering it, which is a different thing, and every woman who has spent any time shopping in department stores understands this distinction without it ever having been explained. The saleswoman 2 racks over has understood from the moment you pick the dress up what is happening and what it requires of her. You are not a customer who wants to be approached right now. You are a customer in the considering phase, and the considering phase requires privacy. She adjusts a sleeve on a nearby display and does not look at you directly, which is the correct response, and she has been doing this long enough to execute it without either ignoring you or hovering, which is the full range of errors available to her at this moment. You walk toward the fitting rooms with the dress over your arm, which is also not a commitment, though it is closer to one. The fitting rooms are curtained alcoves at the back of the department, 3 of them, with a small chair in the corner of each one and a hook on the wall and a mirror that runs floor to ceiling and is, like all department store mirrors, angled in a way that is slightly more flattering than your mirror at home. You have thought about this before, the department store mirror and what it is doing, whether the flattery is a manipulation or simply a consequence of better light, and you have concluded it is both, which is probably the true answer to most questions of this kind. You take off your coat and hang it on the hook. You unbutton your dress, the one you're wearing, and hang it too. You step into the navy wool crepe and reach behind for the zipper, which goes smoothly to the top, which is always a good sign, and you turn to the mirror. The dress fits at the shoulders, which is the hard part, the part that almost no alteration can correct without significant cost. It needs perhaps half an inch taken in at the side seams between the waist and the hip, which you can see in the mirror and confirm with your hands at the seams, which is a manageable alteration, the kind that Mrs. Barone could do in 20 minutes when she's not booked into December. You look at your reflection for a quiet moment. The dress makes you look like someone who takes things seriously but is not grim about it. This is the impression you prefer to make. It is not always the impression you succeed in making, and when the clothing helps with it, you notice. You do not buy it today. This is not weakness or indecision. It is a considered position. You have not brought enough money for a $14.95 dress on a day when you came for thread and a birthday card, and more than that, you have a rule about looking at yourself in department store mirrors and making decisions, which is that a mirror that is better than your mirror at home is not a neutral judge of whether you should spend $14.95. You return the dress to the rack carefully on its proper hanger, sliding it back to approximately where it was so that the woman who comes after you and has also noticed the navy wool crepe behind the unfortunate orange will find it where she expects to. You note its position. You will think about it for 3 days. Either it stays in your thinking or it fades, and which one happens tells you something about whether it was genuinely right. The notions department is on 2, across from clothing, tucked between the fabric remnants and the sewing notions in an arrangement that tells you the buyer who organised this floor understood how women actually shopped, that a woman looking for thread might also need a zipper, might also need a button, might also stop and feel a fabric remnant and spend 3 minutes calculating whether there is enough there for a blouse if she laid the pattern pieces economically. The thread wall is organised by colour family, which is the logical organisation, and the shade you need is a slightly greyed blue, not royal, not navy, something closer to the colour of a blue sky in late afternoon, when some of the brightness has softened, which is what you're trying to match in the skirt you're mending. You brought a swatch. This is not an act of great forethought. It is simply what you do when you go to buy thread, the same way you bring the relevant hardware to the hardware store and the prescription to the pharmacy, because the alternative is buying the wrong thing and returning it, and returning things costs time that you have not been issued any more of than anyone else. You try 3 spools against the swatch in the light from the overhead fixture, holding each one next to the fabric for a measured 5 seconds, then turning it slightly to see how the colour reads in a different angle of the same light. The 3rd spool is right. You know this with the certainty that comes not from colour theory, but from practice, from years of matching threads and fabrics and ribbons and notions, from having an eye trained by doing and corrected by seeing the result on the actual garment and understanding what you had gotten right and what you had missed. You put it in your hand and carry it toward the card department. The card department in a department store in 1963 is different from a card department today in ways that require some restraint to describe, without sounding like you're simply lamenting the passage of time. The cards are thicker and the paper is heavier, and the sentiment inside is more formally calibrated, written in a register that assumes the reader is an adult who would find casualness vaguely insulting on a birthday, because a birthday is an occasion with a specific social weight, and a card that ignores that weight is a card that has not taken the occasion seriously. There are cards for confirmations and for recovery from surgery and for first communions and for the passing of a driving examination, which tells you something about what this culture considered officially significant enough to deserve acknowledgement in paper. There are no cards saying you've got this, which is a phrase that would not exist for another 30 years, and which, in any case, would have struck most women of this era as an intrusion on their privacy. You choose a card for your sister-in-law with the care that the situation requires. She's a difficult person to select cards for, not because she's unkind, but because she has standards about sentiment and finds excessive warmth embarrassing the way some people find lavish praise, embarrassing as a kind of imposition that requires them to feel more than they plan to. You find a card with a small engraved illustration of flowers on the front, tasteful, restrained, the kind of illustration that says someone thought about this design without saying anything particular about feelings. The interior message is 3 lines, formally phrased, wishing her a pleasant day. She will find it acceptable. From her, acceptable is close to a compliment. You pay for the thread and the card at the notions counter, where the woman wraps your thread in a small paper bag that you do not need and will not use for anything else, but that is given automatically, because everything purchased in a department store is parcelled, wrapped against the world outside, sent home in a managed form. You put both purchases in your pocketbook. You button your coat. Before you leave, you stop at the cosmetics counters again, because you are passing through on your way to the door, and because stopping there costs nothing, and it has been a full morning, and you feel, at this hour, the mild goodwill toward life that comes from having accomplished most of what you came to do. You look at the lipstick display at the Revlon counter. There is a shade called Fire and Ice that Revlon has been selling since 1952, and that has remained one of the company's best-known offerings through the entire decade. Not because it is the most sophisticated shade they sell, but because it is exactly right for a specific kind of woman in a specific moment of her life, which is a woman who has decided that red is what she's doing now, done with the pinks and the corals and the roses that were correct in her 20s, ready for a red that makes a considered statement rather than a cautious one. You turn the tester in the light. The red reads warm in this light, slightly orange-based rather than blue-based, which means it would work with your colouring rather than against it. You consider it. You put it back in its holder. You do not buy it today, but you have noted it. The walk to the bus stop takes 4 minutes. You have timed it, not deliberately but through repetition, in the way you know many distances and durations that you have covered often enough for the knowledge to settle into the body. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. You go over what you spent. The thread, which was 42 cents, the card, which was 65 cents, and decide that you were, by the standards of a Tuesday morning in October, quite restrained. The dress you did not buy is somewhere on the second floor of the building behind you, hanging on its hanger, waiting to see if you come back. The gloves are in their case, the fire and ice is in its holder. You have made no impulsive decisions and 1 or 2 things to think about, which is the best possible outcome of a Tuesday morning spent in a department store. The bus comes, you step up. You find a seat on the right side because the right side gets afternoon sun, and even in October the afternoon sun through a bus window is pleasant if you're seated correctly for it. The woman beside you is carrying a department store bag from the same store, one of the small handled bags in the store's signature colour. You exchange a brief nod, the nod of women who have been in the same building doing the same kind of work and have arrived at the same bus stop at approximately the same time, which is as much common ground as any 2 strangers need to occupy the same bench with a degree of fellow feeling. The bus moves, the city slides past the window in its October colours, and behind you the department store continues doing what it always does, its doors opening and closing, its escalators carrying women up to the dresses and down to the cosmetics, its perfume settling into the air and beginning all over again. There is something worth sitting with in that Tuesday morning, before we move to the story that made the world of the counter possible, the skill involved. Not the glamorous kind, not the kind that anyone photographs or writes articles about, but the dense, specific, practical skill of a woman who knows what she is doing inside a particular kind of institution and moves through it with a competence so complete it looks like nothing. She knew which mirror was flattering. She knew how to carry a pocketbook and what that carrying signalled and to whom. She knew that the 3rd spool of thread was right without needing to articulate why. She knew the difference between a dress that fit at the shoulders and would therefore work and a dress that did not and would not, regardless of how good it looked at first glance. She knew how to move through a commercial space without being moved by it, to take from it what she actually needed and leave behind the rest, which sounds like a minimal achievement until you spend any time examining what the space was designed to do to her. The department store in the early 1960s was, as an institution, considerably more sophisticated about the psychology of purchasing than most of its customers understood. The displays had been tested, the lighting had been calibrated, the placement of the cosmetics on the ground floor was not a tradition that had simply persisted from an earlier era, but a deliberate decision, reconsidered and confirmed each time the store was redesigned, because the cosmetics floor functioned as both a commercial enterprise and an orientation system. The first world the customer entered, the one that set the emotional register for everything that came after. You could not reach the escalators, in most stores of this era, without passing through the cosmetics counters, which was not an accident. You could not exit through the main doors without passing through them again, which was also not an accident. The technique was called atmospheric retailing in some of the trade literature, though the women shopping in these stores would not have used that term. They would have said simply that the store was pleasant, that they liked being there, that it was a good place to spend a morning, which is exactly the response the atmospheric retailing had been designed to produce. The warm air against the cold October outside, the perfume building a sense of arrival, the marble floors establishing permanence and quality through the soles of your shoes, the lighting that made everything look slightly better than ordinary. None of these were accidents. All of them were decisions, made by people who spent their working lives studying what made women open their pocketbooks, and all of them were invisible to the women on whom they were operating, not because those women were unintelligent, but because the best persuasion is always the persuasion that does not announce itself. The woman who bought the foundation that morning and the thread and the birthday card was navigating this system with a skill and a self-possession that the system had not entirely counted on, and that it had, in a sense, itself produced. The department store created the sophisticated female shopper by exposing her to decades of sophisticated commercial pressure, and the women who had been shopping in these buildings since the 1930s had developed, through experience, a set of capabilities that were a direct response to what the stores were doing. They knew the tricks because they had been the targets of the tricks, and some of them had been the targets long enough to develop a counterintelligence that was, in its way, impressive. They knew about the flattering mirrors. They knew about the atmospheric perfume. They knew which saleswomen would give you a genuine recommendation and which would give you a commission-motivated one, and in some cases they knew this about specific women at specific counters in specific stores, a kind of institutional knowledge about commercial institutions that passed between women through the same informal channels as the manufacturer knowledge and the thread-matching technique and the correct way to carry a pocketbook. The 3-day rule about the navy dress is worth considering as an artifact of this sophistication. It was not a conscious theory, it was a practice, developed through experience and probably passed on through conversation, that served as a protection against the department store mirror and the atmospheric lighting and the general warmth of a well-maintained commercial space. If you still wanted it in 3 days, you probably actually wanted it. If it had faded from your thinking by Thursday, the wanting had been partly the store's doing and partly yours, and not something you needed to spend $14.95 to address. This kind of self-knowledge, applied to commercial situations, was a real skill, and it was not taught in schools, and it was not in the etiquette books, and it was not the subject of any magazine article, because the magazines were funded in large part by the advertisers whose entire purpose was to produce the wanting in the first place, and articles about how to evaluate whether your wanting was genuine were not in the interest of that funding relationship. She went home with her thread and her card. She sat down for a few minutes before starting the afternoon. The morning had cost her $1.07 in several hours, and it had been, by the measure she applied to such mornings, a success. The dress and the gloves were still in the store, where they would remain until she decided otherwise or until someone else found them first, which was also a possibility she had accounted for and made peace with, because a dress that goes to someone else before you can come back for it was never quite yours in the first place. This is a philosophy that requires some peace with uncertainty. She had it. There is a particular quality of a Tuesday afternoon when the morning's errands are done, and the children are at school and the husband is at work and the house is temporarily quiet. Not a rare quality, a regular one, occurring weekly by the mathematics of school schedules and work schedules, but a quality that women of this era rarely spoke of in terms that acknowledged its value directly, because the value of solitude, of an hour in your own house where no one needed anything from you, was not a thing that the decade's public culture had found a comfortable way to name. The magazines did not photograph this hour, the advertisements did not target it. It was, in the official image of this woman's life, simply the interval between tasks, the pause before the next thing that needed doing. That it was also, for many women, the hour in which they were most fully and specifically themselves was not something the official image had incorporated. Not because it was secret exactly, but because it did not fit the story that the official image was telling. The official image needed her occupied. The empty hour said something about the life that the official image preferred not to address. She folded the list in her pocketbook. She made tea. She sat down at the kitchen table with the thread on the table next to her and the birthday card she still needed to sign, and for 20 minutes before the afternoon started in earnest, she did approximately nothing, which is to say she did the most difficult and most underrated thing that her particular life required of her, which was to simply be still in it. Take a moment with that quiet Tuesday kitchen before we move to the story that built the world the shopper moved through, because the woman at the kitchen table and the woman who built the cosmetics counters she had spent the morning browsing are connected in ways that are not obvious until you sit with them. The department store cosmetics counter as it existed in 1963, with its white-coated saleswomen and its glass cases of precisely arranged products, and its habit of applying samples directly to the customer's hand and letting her see the result in flattering light, was not an inevitability. It was a creation. Someone made it. Someone decided it should work that way, and then went out and made it work that way, against considerable resistance and through considerable ingenuity, and the story of how it came to be is a story about a particular kind of ambition that is interesting for what it produced and also for what it understood about women that the established industry had missed. Josephine Esther Mentzer was born in Queens, New York, sometime around 1908, though the exact year was a matter she revised thoughtfully throughout her life, an act of biographical editing that she would probably not have considered unusual, given the era's understanding of a woman's relationship to her own stated age. Her parents were Central European Jewish immigrants, her father a hardware store owner, her mother a woman of elegance and presence who had arrived in America with very little and was assembling something out of what the new country provided. Queens in the early 1900s was a particular kind of world, immigrant and striving and specific in its daily textures, shaped by the rhythms of a neighbourhood economy in which everyone knew what everyone else was doing, and a family's standing was a daily negotiation with the people who could see your front porch. Estee, as the family called her, watched her mother's face. This is not a small thing. The way a woman applies cold cream in the morning, the ritual of it, the unhurried attention to something that is simultaneously private and performative, the way a woman decides how she will present herself to the world before the world sees her. This is the kind of thing that a daughter can absorb deeply if she's paying attention, and Estee was paying attention. Her mother's skincare routine was not a luxury in the sense of being unnecessary. It was a practice, a form of maintenance that was also a form of self-regard, the daily assertion that her own face was worth attention. Estee grew up inside that assertion and found it compelling. When Estee was a young woman, her uncle John Schatz came to live with the family. John Schatz was a chemist, genuinely trained, seriously interested in the science of emulsions and formulations and the way certain compounds interacted with skin. He made things in the garage, creams and lotions and treatments, some of them quite effective, all of them produced with the careful empiricism of someone who'd been trained to think about what ingredients actually did rather than what a marketing copywriter might claim they did. He let Estee try the products, and Estee, who had her mother's instinctive connection to the ritual of beauty and her own formidable capacity for enthusiasm, tried the creams and found that she believed in them, and her believing in them was the beginning of everything. She started where most women of her background and era started, when they had something to sell and no access to conventional channels of distribution, which is everywhere except the conventional channels. She demonstrated the creams at beauty salons. This was a more specific choice than it sounds. A beauty salon is a place where women go to be worked on, to submit their hair and their faces to the hands of someone who knows more than they do about the technical requirements of the thing being done. A woman in a salon chair is already in a state of receptivity that ordinary commercial situations do not produce. She is already letting someone touch her. She has already decided that this is a morning for attending to herself. She is therefore, from the perspective of a woman with face creams to demonstrate, the ideal audience. Estee understood this, though she would not have put it in those marketing terms, because the marketing vocabulary did not yet exist for what she was doing. She gave the creams away, generously, without apparent reluctance, pressing jars into the hands of women who had not asked for them but who, once the cream was on their faces, found they were interested in what it did. The gift was the strategy. The gift created an obligation of attention, not a formal obligation, but the informal one that exists when someone has given you something and you have used it and found it worth using. The woman who received the cream for free and came back to buy it was not being generous in return. She was simply following the logic of something that had worked. Estee had turned free samples into a sales technique of remarkable effectiveness, and she had done it not as a calculated scheme but as an expression of her genuine conviction that once a woman tried these products, she would want to keep using them. She was right. She talked about the products with a specificity and a warmth that combined to produce something that felt like expertise without condescension, like the advice of a friend who happened to know considerably more than you about what your skin needed. She would look at a woman's face the way a tailor looks at a body, with the kind of focused attention that sees not what is already there, but what might be improved and what the right tool would do to it. Then she would reach out, with a confidence that came from total belief in what she was doing, and touch the woman's face and apply the cream herself, and step back and say something specific about what she had observed and why she had chosen this particular formulation rather than another. The woman in the chair did not feel sold to, she felt noticed. The distinction was everything. The department store was the destination, but it did not open its doors easily. Saks Fifth Avenue in 1948 was the target that Estee Lauder had set for herself, and the story of how she reached it runs entirely through the character of a woman who did not accept a first refusal, or a second or a third as answers that required her compliance. She asked to see the cosmetics buyer. She was not given a meeting. She sent products to the buyer. The products were received, assessed by someone with the professional obligation to assess them, and found to be of quality, but the buyer was not prepared to take a chance on a woman with no established distribution, no proven sales record in a major retail environment, and no obvious reason to expect that she could perform at the level Saks required of its cosmetics vendors. The buyer said no in various ways over several interactions. Estee heard the refusals and understood them as conditions to be changed rather than conclusions to be accepted. The opportunity came through the kind of arranged chance that serious people manufacture. She managed to attend a charity luncheon where a senior Saks executive would be present. She brought products. She found a way to get the products to the relevant people. She was charming and she was specific, and she was not modest about what she had, because modesty in commercial contexts is a liability, and she had worked out this fact early and acted on it consistently. The first order was small. It was a trial, given to a woman who had been persistent enough to deserve a trial, not because the buyer was convinced, but because the buyer had run out of reasons to keep refusing, which is a different thing, and Estee Lauder knew the difference and would take it. She sold out the first Saks order in 2 days, not 2 weeks, not gradually over the course of a selling period. 2 days, which is the result you produce when you understand your customer and you have something she actually wants, and you have spent years developing a method of presenting it to her that works. 2 days turned the buyer's tentative trial into something more interesting, which was the question of what would happen if this woman had a full counter rather than a small allocation. What happened is the story of the next 20 years, which is the story of one cosmetics line expanding from one counter at one Saks to counters at Neiman Marcus and Bloomingdale's and every significant department store in every significant American city, of a brand that positioned itself consistently and successfully as the accessible luxury, the quality product that a woman of modest means could justify on the grounds that her face was worth it, that the ingredient quality and the results justified the price premium, that she was not being extravagant but prudent. This positioning was not accidental. It was worked out by Estee and her husband Leonard, who joined the business and ran the financial and operational side with a competence that matched her salesmanship, with a care that shows in every subsequent business decision the company made. The gift with purchase became a company policy, formalized and deployed at scale, each new counter launching with a promotional offer that gave customers something extra when they spent above a threshold. The threshold was set to encourage a purchase slightly larger than the average, to move women from buying the one thing they came for to buying the one thing they came for and the one thing that went with it. The gift was real. It had actual value, a small but genuine miniature of a product the company was proud of. Not a trinket, but a thing she would actually use, which meant the gift itself functioned as a demonstration of the quality of the full-size product, which meant the gift was both a giveaway and an advertisement, both a generosity and a trial sample, doing multiple kinds of work simultaneously for a cost per unit that the company had calculated carefully. This was the genius of it. Everything was doing multiple things at once. Youth Dew arrived in 1953 and changed the conversation about what fragrance was for. The product was marketed as a bath oil that could also be worn as a perfume, which was a small distinction with large commercial implications. Most American women who wore fragrance in 1953 wore perfume, which was expensive by the bottle and used carefully. You applied it to your pulse points on the occasions that warranted it. It was a special occasion item, which meant its market was bounded by the frequency of special occasions, which in most women's lives was not especially high. A bath oil designed to be used in the tub and then worn on the body was a daily use item. A daily use item reaches a much larger market and generates much more repeat purchasing than a special occasion item, which are commercial facts of considerable significance. But Youth Dew was not simply a daily fragrance, it was a specific fragrance, a dense, warm, complex scent that was ambitious without being inaccessible, built around spice and amber and a depth that lingered rather than fading quickly. A sillage, as the perfumers say, that lasted through a full day and into the evening, and that left a woman smelling like she had made a decision about herself rather than simply applied a product. It smelled like intent. It smelled like someone who understood that her presence in a room was something worth announcing and had found the appropriate means by which to do it. Women bought it in remarkable quantities, which surprised everyone in the department store fragrance business who had not understood that there was a vast untapped market for a serious fragrance at a price point that made daily use financially feasible. By the middle of the 1960s, Estée Lauder was a face that women in department stores recognized, not as a corporate entity, not as a brand manager, but as a specific woman, a woman who had been photographed at social events and who appeared in her own company's advertisements in a role that was not quite spokesperson and not quite celebrity but something in between, the woman whose name was on the package and who appeared to be the person most likely to have made it personally, which was partly true and partly a construction as careful as the fragrance itself. She attended store openings. She worked counters herself, well into the era when she no longer needed to, because the working of the counter was her original skill and her genuine pleasure, and also because her presence at a counter produced a response in customers that no proxy could match. A woman who had heard of Estée Lauder, who had bought the products and used them and found them worth using, who now found herself face to face with the woman whose name she had read on the jar for 15 years, experienced something that the company's sales reports could measure but that resisted full description. It was recognition. It was the peculiar warmth of having a private relationship with a name suddenly become a real one. It sold products. It also meant something beyond the selling. The saleswomen who worked the counters in the stores were trained in the methods Estée had developed herself, the application technique, the way of touching the face with confidence and care, the language of skin that made the customer feel that what she was hearing was specific to her situation, rather than a recitation from a sales training manual. Whether it was specific, or whether the training was sophisticated enough to produce the effect of specificity, is a question that the customers themselves could not entirely answer, and in some measure did not care about, because the feeling of being attended to specifically is valuable even if the specificity is partly performed. The women trained in these methods were, in a very real sense, inheriting Estée Lauder's original insight. The insight that the product being sold was not the cream, but the attention, not the foundation, but the feeling of being seen clearly by someone who knew what they were looking at. The company that Estée and Leonard built did not remain a single brand. By the end of the 1960s and into the 70s, the Estée Lauder companies had acquired or developed secondary lines aimed at different market segments. Clinique in 1968 being the most significant, a brand positioned not around luxury and aspiration but around clinical efficacy and the vocabulary of dermatology, aimed at a younger, more skeptical consumer who had been raised in an era of advertising and had developed the mild suspicion of anything that sounded too beautiful to be true. Clinique wore lab coats and spoke the language of allergy-tested and fragrance-free and dermatologist-developed, and it reached the women that Estée Lauder the brand had not quite captured, which expanded the company's total market without cannibalizing its core. This is the shape of a business built by someone who understood not one kind of customer, but the full range of them, who could see the 55-year-old woman who wanted radiance and the 25-year-old woman who wanted proof, and knew that both of them were buying something from the same fundamental place, the place that said your face is worth attention, and that attention is available here if you're willing to reach across the counter for it. The counter was not neutral, the counter was designed. But what happened at the counter, between a trained woman with samples and a customer who was willing to stop and listen, was also something real, and the realness of it was what Estée Lauder had known from the beginning and what she spent her life making commercially available to everyone who walked through a department store door. She died in 2004 at an age she would have found worth protecting, and the company her uncle's garage chemistry helped start is still in every department store that has a cosmetics floor, still placing its products at the same careful angles, still training its saleswomen in the methods she developed, still giving small gifts with purchase to women who spend above the threshold. The gift is wrapped nicely, the threshold is calculated carefully, the marble floors are polished. And somewhere in a department store right now, a woman is pausing at a counter because something caught her eye, and a saleswoman is straightening slightly, and the morning is arranging itself around a transaction that is also, in some measure, that resists quantification, but insists on being acknowledged, an act of attention. The story of what happened at the counters between saleswomen and customers is also a story about training, about how a specific approach to beauty selling was transmitted from one woman to another across hundreds of counters in dozens of cities, and about how that transmission changed what American women understood about their own faces. The training that the major cosmetics companies developed and delivered to their department store saleswomen in the post-war era was the carrier signal for an entire set of beliefs about skin, about age, about what was improvable and what was simply to be accepted, and about the role of commercial products in mediating between a woman and the face she wished she had. The training was thorough. Helena Rubinstein sent representatives to stores to work directly with saleswomen at her counters, demonstrating application technique and product knowledge and the specific approach to customer interaction that the company had developed through decades of experience. Estée Lauder's training was similarly hands-on. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive, oriented around the direct demonstration method that Estée herself had used in the salons of the 1940s, and that the company continued to emphasize because experience had shown it to be the most effective sales technique available. The method was, look at the face, say specifically what you see, apply the product yourself, step back, and let the customer see the result. Do not describe what the product will do, show what it does, let the evidence make the case. This was effective for commercial reasons, but it also had an effect on the customers that was not purely commercial, or rather that was commercial in the sense that it increased the likelihood of purchase, but that also did something else, something that the commercial calculation did not fully account for. A woman who has had her face looked at carefully, who has had specific and accurate observations made about her skin, who has had a product applied by someone who knew what they were doing and then seen a result she found pleasing in the mirror, has had an experience of genuine attentive care that she does not get very often in the course of ordinary life. The doctor's appointment is designed for a different kind of care. The beauty parlour is more social and more about the hair than the face. The department store cosmetics counter was one of the few places in mid-century American life where a woman could receive focused attention on her face, delivered by someone who had been trained to give that attention, and who was giving it in the service of a sale, but was giving it genuinely. The women who trained saleswomen understood this. Some of them talked about it directly, in the language of service and care rather than in the language of sales technique, though the commercial purpose was always present and was never pretended away. Helena Rubinstein, who had her own complicated relationship with the distinction between caring for women's faces and making money from women's faces, was a believer in the idea that beauty education was a genuine service, that teaching women about their own skin was doing them a favour that the sale was almost incidental to. This belief was self-serving. In the obvious sense that a company whose sales depend on women believing their skin requires professional attention has every incentive to encourage women to believe exactly that. But it was also sincere. Rubinstein did believe in what she was selling, at a level that went beyond commercial necessity. This is not entirely to her credit. The belief that women's faces needed professional intervention was itself a product of a culture that told women continuously that their natural faces were insufficient. But it was genuine. Elizabeth Arden, Rubinstein's contemporary and lifelong rival, built her business on a slightly different emphasis, one that privileged the ritual and the luxury rather than the science and the treatment. Arden's salons, which were the physical embodiment of her brand long before she had department store counters, were spaces in which women were pampered in an almost theatrical way, wrapped in pink and soothed with products that smelled divine and treated in a style that said you deserve this, that the investment of time and money in your own appearance was an act of appropriate self-regard rather than vanity. This was a different sales argument from Rubinstein's, but it served the same commercial purpose and operated on the same underlying cultural assumption that there was a version of your face that was better than the version you woke up with, and that commerce had the means to get you there. The women who built the American cosmetics industry in the first half of the 20th century were, almost without exception, themselves immigrants, or the daughters of immigrants, women who had arrived in a country that was willing to sell you something, but required you to show up in a certain way before it took you seriously. Rubinstein was Polish. Arden was Canadian, but positioned herself as British. Lauder was the daughter of Hungarian and Czech Jews, who had arrived at Ellis Island with the same fundamental project as every other immigrant family, which was to build something in a country that claimed to offer the building materials to anyone willing to work with them. The The cosmetics business attracted these women not only because it was commercially accessible, requiring relatively modest initial capital and no formal credentials, but because it was a business in which the product was transformation, the promise that who you were when you arrived did not have to be who you stayed. This was a promise that resonated very specifically with people whose entire immigration story was a version of the same transformation narrative. The department store cosmetics counter was therefore not simply a sales point for products. It was a location in a larger American story about the relationship between identity and transformation, about whether who you were was fixed or whether it was improvable, about what the improving cost and who got to decide what needed improving. The answer the cosmetics industry gave consistently was that what needed improving was your face, which was always capable of being better, and that the products available behind the glass cases were the means by which you could make it so. This was an answer with commercial implications so obvious they scarcely need naming. It was also an answer that many women found genuinely comforting, not because they were being manipulated, or not only because of that, but because in a culture that told women their value was substantially tied to their appearance, the idea that their appearance was improvable rather than fixed was in some sense liberating. If beauty was something you could work on, then it was not simply something you were given or not given, not simply luck or genetics or the accident of birth, it was something you could do. It was a form of agency. The products that were sold behind those counters in the 1950s and 60s were, by a mixed measure, effective, and the variation in their efficacy is worth noting because it complicates the simple narrative of cosmetics as pure commercial fiction. Some of the moisturizers sold at department store cosmetics counters were genuinely good for skin. The basic logic of barrier moisturizers, of applying oils and emollients to the skin surface to prevent moisture loss and reduce the appearance of fine lines caused by dryness, was sound, and the better formulated products of the era produced results that their users correctly identified as improvement. Some of the foundations were genuinely good at what foundations are supposed to do, evening the skin tone and providing a smooth surface for additional products, and lasting through the demands of a full day without requiring midday attention. Some of the fragrances were genuinely beautiful in the way that well-made things are beautiful, constructed with craft and care, and designed to remain coherent and pleasant through hours of wearing. Some of the products were not effective in the ways the packaging claimed. Some of the anti-aging creams of the era promised structural benefits to the skin that the active ingredients could not deliver, because the science of the era and the regulatory environment of the era, which was considerably more permissive than what would later develop, allowed claims that subsequent research would have required to be substantially modified. The line between a moisturizer that improved the appearance of skin and a cream that reversed aging was commercially convenient and scientifically slippery, and the cosmetics companies of the post-war era stood on the slippery side of that line with some frequency and with a confidence that their advertising budgets helped maintain. The Federal Trade Commission took an interest in some of these claims over the decades, and some of the most dramatic assertions were eventually pulled back, but the general pattern of promising more than could be strictly proven remained a feature of the industry's commercial communication well beyond the period we are discussing. What the women who bought these products actually received was therefore a mixture of genuine improvement and genuine fantasy, and the proportion of each varied by product and by formulation, and by the specific condition of the specific face applying it. A woman with dry skin who bought a good moisturizer and used it consistently did receive benefit. A woman who bought a cream that promised to reverse 15 years of aging and expected it to do so was going to receive something other than what was promised. Though she might receive a texture improvement and a pleasanter morning routine, and the feeling of having done something attentive for herself, which were real benefits even if they were not the benefits advertised. The women who kept buying the products understood this mix, to varying degrees of explicitness. You hear it in the conversations about cosmetics that women of the era had, the dry realism that coexisted with the genuine enthusiasm. She knows the cream is not going to make her look 35. She knows this. And she buys it anyway, because it smells pleasant, and it makes her face feel smooth, and the ritual of applying it in the morning is a moment of the day that is hers, and that feels like something worth doing. This is not delusion. It is a sophisticated negotiation between the commercial promise and the actual utility, in which the actual utility is sufficient to justify the purchase even when the commercial promise is not entirely accurate. It is the kind of sophisticated commercial negotiation that American women of this era were engaged in continuously, in a dozen product categories, and that their successors are still engaged in, because the structure of the thing has not changed as much as the specific products have. The department store cosmetics floor in 1963 was therefore a complicated place that was doing several things simultaneously. It was selling products that were sometimes effective and sometimes not. It was delivering attention and care that was commercially motivated but genuinely felt. It was maintaining a standard of professional presentation that had real value and that required real skill to achieve. It was operating inside a commercial system whose underlying argument was that women's faces were insufficient and required correction, which was a damaging argument with no simple exit, because the argument had been absorbed into culture so thoroughly that rejecting it required a conscious and effortful counter-narrative that most women did not have the time or energy to maintain continuously. It was also a place where real human connections were made, where the woman who came to buy her usual foundation and stayed for a longer conversation about something new and left feeling better about her Tuesday morning than she had before she stopped, was having an experience that was real and that she valued, and that the commercial system had produced even if it had not intended anything beyond the transaction. The products lined up behind those glass cases were also, in their physical arrangement, a kind of argument about time. The display was updated seasonally. New shades arrived in the fall and again in the spring, coordinated with the fashion cycle in a way that made the cosmetics purchase feel connected to the larger rhythm of getting dressed for each new season, which is to say connected to the rhythm of time passing and the ongoing project of keeping up with it. A woman who returned to the same counter every 4 months, as Mrs. Patterson returned to the saleswoman with the customer book, was participating in a ritual that marked the year in a specific way, a way that had nothing to do with holidays or weather, but that had its own seasonal texture, the new autumn shades arriving with the new autumn fabrics, the spring collection coming in just as the heavy coats were being put away. The department store organised the year for its customers in this way, without anyone ever saying that this was what it was doing. It just kept putting out the new collection, and the women kept coming back to see what was new, and the year kept turning, and the counters kept being restocked, and the ritual kept going. There is something worth pausing on in that image of the counter, the white coat, the confident application, the practiced warmth of the saleswoman who made every customer feel noticed. Because someone is wearing that coat. Someone has been wearing it since before the store opened, setting up the display in the quiet hour before the customers arrive, checking the testers, restocking the samples, adjusting the planogram layout for the 3rd time this week because the company sent a new one, and the supervisor has made clear that adherence is expected. Someone arrived at this building before the marble floors were full of people, and before the perfume had built to its full daytime register, when the air still smelled faintly of the cleaning products used on the cases, and the only sound was the freight elevator and other employees doing the same preparation in other departments. Someone stood on that floor for 9 hours. Someone learned to smile with exactly the right proportion of genuine warmth and professional distance, a proportion that is not calculated consciously, but that has been refined over months of practice, and that is as specific and difficult to maintain as any other skilled performance, especially in the hours between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, when your feet have been on marble since before breakfast, and the next break is a full 45 minutes away, and the last 3 customers have all wanted to try the same 4 shades of lipstick and none of them have purchased anything. You arrive at the employees' entrance at 7:45, which is the back of the building, which looks nothing like the front. The front entrance is an exercise in a specific kind of commercial optimism, marble and glass and carefully chosen light, the architectural promise that what is inside is worth coming in for. The back entrance is where things actually happen, where the trucks deliver the stock and the employees come and go, where the building shows its working parts without apology. A narrow door, a hallway with institutional paint in a colour that has no name but that exists in every back-of-house commercial space in America. A beige that made sense to someone at some point in history and has been maintained through inertia since. A coat of hooks, a time card rack. You find your card, which has your employee number on it, and you slot it into the machine and it stamps the time, which is the official beginning of your working day, a moment that has a mechanical precision that feels somewhat at odds with the kind of work you're actually going to be doing for the next 9 hours. You are 23 years old and you have been working in the cosmetics department for 14 months, which places you in the middle category of experience, past the initial period when you were learning the basic mechanics of the job, past the period of second-guessing yourself at every interaction, and firmly into the period of competence that has its own particular character and its own particular pressures. You know what you're doing now. You can apply foundation in 3.5 minutes without it looking applied, which is the goal of foundation application in this era. Not to transform the face, but to even it, to present the best version of the existing face rather than to construct a different one entirely. You can identify a skin type at a distance of 3 feet. You know which formulas work for which conditions and which customers will be genuinely helped by the moisturizer you're recommending, and which customers have simply come to the counter because they are killing time between the shoe department and the lunchroom and have decided that a conversation at the cosmetics counter is a reasonable way to spend the interval. You serve both of them with equal attention because the policy does not distinguish between them, and also because the woman killing time is sometimes the woman who buys the most, once she's been given reason to stop and look. You change from your street shoes to your work shoes at your locker before going to the floor, which is one of the small practical calculations that distinguish a saleswoman who's been doing this for over a year from one who has not. Your work shoes are black pumps with a heel of precisely 1.5 inches, because lower than that looks casual and higher than that does not survive 9 hours on marble, and you learned this through the first 2 months of the job, during which you wore shoes that were either too flat or too high, and arrived home each evening with a quality of foot pain that felt, in its inventiveness and its persistence, almost personal. The right shoe is not glamorous, it is correct. Correct is considerably more useful. The floor before opening has a quality that the floor during business hours does not have, and you have come to value this hour more than you might have expected. The cosmetics department is yours right now, yours and the other cosmetic saleswomen's, and the arrangement of the space is visible in a way it is not when the customers are in it, when the floor is full of movement and conversation and the general productive noise of commerce. Right now you can see the architecture of the thing, the way the counters are placed to channel traffic, the way the lighting has been positioned to make every surface catch and hold the light, the way the testers are arranged to invite touching. You know all of this. 14 months has given you a structural understanding of the department that feels different from simply knowing where the products are. You know how the space works. You know what it is trying to do. This knowledge does not make you cynical. It makes you effective. Setting up the counter takes 22 minutes when you do it correctly, and somewhat less when you do it in a hurry, which is how you know 22 minutes is the right amount of time. The testers are cleaned first, the caps removed and the applicators wiped with the small cloth that lives in your white coat pocket, replaced when it gets dirty. The displays are checked against the planogram, which is the document that comes from the company's regional office and specifies the exact placement of every item on every counter, illustrated with diagrams that show the precise angle at which each product should be positioned, the precise spacing between them. You follow the planogram because you are required to, and because some of it makes sense. The most popular shades of lipstick at the front of the tester row, where they are accessible without the customer having to reach past less popular shades. Some of it makes less sense to you, but you follow it anyway, because the planogram comes from people who have data, and you have 14 months of experience at one counter in one store, and the correct attitude toward the limits of your own perspective is, you have decided, humility. You have a note in your head about the planogram that you have not shared with your supervisor, which is that the 3 lipstick shades placed at the near end of the tester row are placed there because the company considers them the line's flagship shades, shades that best represent what the brand does, and that they may well be the best shades in a theoretical sense, but that at your particular counter, with the particular stream of women who pass through your particular department on a Tuesday in October, the shades that are actually tested and purchased most consistently are slightly different, and that the arrangement the planogram specifies is therefore producing a mismatch between what is most available and what is most wanted. You know this because you watch and you count, and you have been watching and counting for 14 months. You have not said it because saying it would require going through channels that are not designed for the kind of observation you are making, and you have made a quiet calculation that the effort is unlikely to produce the outcome, and you would rather use the energy on something you can actually change. The doors open at 9 and the floor begins to fill in the way water fills a container, finding the low points first, building gradually. Tuesday mornings in October bring a particular kind of shopper, one you have come to recognise and appreciate. She's not in a hurry in the way the lunch hour crowd is in a hurry, or the Saturday afternoon crowd, or the pre-holiday crowd with its particular quality of panicked urgency. She's a woman who has organised her morning around being here, who has gotten other people out the door and now has time that is genuinely hers, or as genuinely hers as Tuesday mornings tend to be for women managing households and families. She arrives with a kind of considered openness, a willingness to be interested that the hurried shopper does not have time for. Your first customer is at 9:12, a woman in her mid-40s who approaches the counter with the specific body language of someone who knows she wants something, but has not entirely decided what. This is the best starting position for a counter interaction. The woman who knows exactly what she wants and has come to get it efficiently is a transaction, a pleasant one, but still a transaction. The woman who knows she wants something but is still deciding is a conversation. You like the conversation better. She asks about foundation, which is the most personal purchase available at a cosmetics counter, because foundation is the product that addresses the face's relationship with its own shortcomings, and the way a woman approaches the foundation question tells you a considerable amount about how she thinks about her face and herself. Some women approach it technically, asking about coverage levels and finish types and ingredients, which means they have read about foundations and what they're reading confirmed and applied. Some women approach it emotionally, saying things like, "I just want to look less tired," which is not a technical specification, but a statement of desired effect, and the technical answer you give in response to that needs to be translated from product description into expected outcome, or it will not land. This woman uses the word coverage, which is the technical vocabulary, but her voice has some of the emotional register underneath it, the slight diffidence of someone who is asking for help and would prefer not to have to say so directly. You look at her skin. You look at it the way Estee Lauder looked at skin, the way the method teaches, which is as a system of qualities and conditions rather than a list of complaints, which means you are not making a catalogue of what is wrong, but making an assessment of what is there and what approach would serve it best. Her skin has texture at the cheeks. It is drier than average, and the underlying tone is neutral, running slightly warm but not dramatically. She would be well served by a liquid formula rather than a powder, by a medium coverage rather than full, and by a shade that matches her neck rather than trying to match her cheek, where she has been in the sun, and the colour is not representative of the underlying tone. You say all of this in approximately 45 seconds, in language that is specific without being medical, that conveys expertise without condescension, that gives her information and a recommendation, and makes clear that the recommendation is based on looking at her particular face rather than a general prescription, which is the whole point. She asks about the undertone, using that word correctly, because she has been to cosmetics counters before and has absorbed the vocabulary. You confirm what she has already sensed about her own undertone, and add a piece of information she had not known, which is that her undertone shifts slightly between summer and winter because of sun exposure, which means the shade that is right for her in October is not exactly the same shade that will be right for her in July, and she might want to keep this in mind when she comes back in the spring. You're giving her information she will not be able to use for 6 months. You are doing this because it is accurate and useful, and because a customer who leaves with more than she came for in terms of understanding tends to come back. She buys the foundation. She also buys the powder, because you mentioned the powder in the course of discussing how she would finish the look she was building, and the mention was informational, not persuasive, which means she made the decision herself based on information you gave her, which is the preferred outcome both commercially and personally. You do not like to feel that you have pushed a customer toward a purchase she did not want. You like to feel that you have helped her find what she was looking for, possibly including things she had not known she was looking for when she arrived. You write her name in your customer book after she leaves, along with the shades she purchased, the condition of her skin as you assessed it, and the note about the seasonal undertone shift. The customer book is the most useful professional tool you possess. It is not required by the store. It is not in the employee handbook. It is a system you developed in your first 6 months of this job when you noticed that women came back and expected to be recognised and remembered, and that the ones who were remembered came back with a consistency and a loyalty that had a direct and quantifiable effect on your commission income. The women who felt like known customers made larger purchases when they returned, asked for you by name, and referred other women to the counter with a warmth that no advertisement could produce. because the warmth came from their own experience rather than from a copywriter in New York. You keep the customer book in your locker. You have never left it on the counter. You understand that it is yours, not the store's, and you would take it with you if you ever moved to another position. The commission structure is the invisible architecture of your entire working day. Everyone in retail on commission knows this, but it takes time to learn what it means practically, how the knowledge of commission operates on your behavior in ways you do not always consciously intend. You are not anxious about commission in the way that you were in the first few months, when every interaction that did not result in a sale felt like a personal inadequacy, and the daily commission tally felt like a report card on your worth as a person. You have moved past that. What you have moved to is something more precise, a continuous low-level awareness that sits behind every interaction, informing how long you spend with a customer who is unlikely to purchase. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. How quickly you recognize a customer who is likely to, and what she might need to move from considering to deciding. This awareness is not mercenary. It is efficient, which is different, and the distinction matters to you. By mid-morning, the counter has had 6 customers and 3 purchases, which is a respectable ratio for a Tuesday before noon. One of the 3 was a return customer, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who buys the same foundation every 4 months and has been doing so for 2 years, and who you know well enough to have a brief genuine conversation with about the new shade in the compact collection before she decides it is not for her and buys the thing she came for. Mrs. Patterson is the backbone of your commission income, not because she spends a great deal at any single visit, but because she comes back consistently, and when she comes back she brings the quality of loyalty that a woman extends to someone she trusts, which sometimes manifests as simply buying the usual thing, and sometimes manifests as trying something new, because you suggested it with sufficient confidence. Lunch is 30 minutes, which is not long enough for lunch, but is what the employee schedule allocates, and you have made peace with it the way you have made peace with several aspects of this job, by deciding that the things you cannot change are not worth the energy of resenting, and the things you can change are worth addressing specifically and concretely. You take your lunch to the employee break room on the 6th floor, which is accessible by the freight elevator and is furnished with institutional tables and chairs and a coffee burner that has been in continuous operation since 7 in the morning, and whose output at noon has the character of something that was only technically coffee to begin with and has since developed its own additional properties. You eat your sandwich. The wax paper it is wrapped in makes a sound when you open it that is one of the unremarked sounds of this era. A soft crinkle that belongs to packed lunches and kitchen drawers and the specific domestic economy of women who make their own food, rather than buying it, because making your own is what you do when you have a family and a budget and standards about what your family eats, and an understanding that these 3 things require effort to maintain simultaneously. The other women from the floor come in on their staggered lunch times. There is a quality of ease in these conversations that the floor does not allow, a directness that is possible, because the customers are not here, and the supervisor is not at the desk in the corner, and you are not performing in any of the ways the floor requires. Someone had a difficult morning, a customer who wanted to return a product purchased 6 weeks ago that she had clearly used most of and had not managed to lose the receipt for, which put the saleswoman in the position of following the store's satisfaction guarantee, which technically allows this kind of return, while also having feelings about it that she was not permitted to express. The store's policy says the customer is right. The saleswoman's feelings say something more complicated. The break room is where the something more complicated gets said, and then set down, because the something more complicated cannot come back to the floor with you, or it becomes visible in ways that are professionally damaging. Someone else had a run of returns that morning, products purchased over the previous week that arrived back in the hands of their purchasers with a quality of dissatisfaction that was entirely legitimate in some cases, and in others was the result of the customer buying something and then finding an identical version at a lower price elsewhere, which the store's guarantee also accommodates, but which produces a specific type of commission reversal that feels different from a legitimate product return, though the math is the same. The commission reversal is one of the facts of this job that you have not entirely made peace with, because it is the one that reaches backward and takes from you something you had considered earned, and the retroactive quality of it is harder to accept than a simple low commission day. Back on the floor at 1:15, the afternoon has a different register from the morning. The women who shop in the early afternoon are often women who have come downtown for lunch, women on their hour out of an office who are using the tail of the hour to browse before they have to be back at a desk, women who are not in the mood to make a full purchase decision, but who are open to being interested. They buy lipstick, they buy mascara, they buy the small decided purchases that can be made in under 5 minutes because they have under 5 minutes, and they know what they want and they have the money for it, and that is all the purchase requires. These customers are efficient and often generous in the sense of not requiring much of you beyond accuracy and speed, and there are days when the afternoon lipstick run produces a commission that surprises you pleasantly after a morning of careful, longer interactions. Your 2:30 customer is the kind of customer you work for, the reason the customer book exists and the reason you have been refining your method for 14 months. She is a woman in her 50s who approaches the counter carrying a department store bag from the clothing department, which tells you she has already been shopping this morning and is not here incidentally, but has planned this stop. She's looking for a lipstick for a specific occasion, which she tells you about before you have asked. A daughter's wedding in the spring, a spring wedding, a mother of the bride, a woman who will be photographed in natural light and will appear in those photographs for the rest of her daughter's life and for the rest of her own. And who understands this? Who is thinking about it? Who is here precisely because she understands it? You ask about the dress. You ask about the time of day because the light at a morning ceremony is different from the light at an afternoon one, and what reads well in one reads differently in the other. You ask about the venue, inside or outside, because church light and garden light produce different effects on colour. She answers all of these questions with a specificity that tells you she has been thinking about this for a while. You are not the first cosmetics counter she has visited on this question. You will not be the last. But you are the one who asked about the light in the venue, which means you are giving her something specific and usable that she may not have gotten elsewhere. You work through the reds methodically, not all of them, because showing a woman 57 shades of red is not helping her. It is presenting her with a decision problem rather than a solution. You show her 4 shades, carefully chosen based on what she has told you about her colouring, and the occasion, and the light, and you apply each one to her wrist and let her see them together in the counterlight, naming specifically what each one does and what the specific wedding context would do to each one in turn. The 4th shade is right, not the obvious red, not the red that says red lipstick, but the deep warm red that sits between rose and berry, that photographs with depth and warmth rather than drama. She holds her wrist to the light. She looks at it for a moment. She says yes without any additional deliberation, which is the response of someone who has been looking for a specific thing and has found it, and the certainty in her voice is one of the pleasures of this work, the clarity of a match made correctly. She buys the lipstick. She also buys the mascara, which arose naturally from a question about how the lipstick would read in photographs relative to the eyes, and you told her honestly that a clean, defined lash would balance the depth of the red, and that the mascara you were recommending would give her that without the heavy quality of some formulas. And she believed you because you had demonstrated in the previous 10 minutes that your recommendations were specific to her situation rather than generic, and she had reason to trust specific recommendations from someone who had been paying attention. You write her in the customer book. She is a spring wedding customer. You will see her again before May. The last hour. This is where the training and the practice and the comfortable shoes and the customer book all come to bear. Your feet have been on this floor for 8 hours and 40 minutes, and they are tired in the precise way that standing on a hard surface in shoes with any heel height at all eventually produces tiredness, which is a deep fatigue that goes past the sole and into the ankle and the calf and up into the lower back, which has been quietly registering its opinion of this profession since approximately 2 in the afternoon. Your face is still organised into the expression of professional engagement and warmth, which is still genuine but is now also partly habitual, maintained by the training and the professionalism, and you are aware of both components, and that is fine. The last hour is the last hour because it ends. You have 2 more customers before close. One buys a compact, a deliberate quick purchase on her way out of the building. One tries 3 products and buys nothing, which happens and which you accept without resentment because you gave her your full attention, and she is leaving with better information about what her skin needs than she arrived with, and she will come back when she is ready, and when she does she will ask for you, and she will. This is not confidence in the sense of arrogance. It is confidence in the sense of 14 months of paying attention and learning what that attention produces. The closing routine is methodical. Caps on the testers, display cards adjusted back to planogram, the tray of demonstration materials cleaned, the counter surface wiped down with the solution that removes fingerprints, and the traces of products applied during demonstrations and the general evidence of a day of commerce. You log your sales at the supervisor's station. The numbers are good for a Tuesday in October. Not exceptional. Good. You retrieve your customer book and your street bag from your locker. You change your shoes. The employee's entrance delivers you back into October, into the evening version of the city, which smells of traffic and the specific cold of early autumn after dark. Your feet on the pavement know they are not on marble. The difference is immediate and considerable. You walk to the bus stop. You do not think about the counter. You think about dinner and whether there is enough of the soup left from Sunday, or whether you will need to make something else. The bus comes. You sit down. You have been on your feet since 7:45. It is 5:22. You do some arithmetic without meaning to. The commission calculation that happens at the end of every day, the rough total before reversals, the estimate of what will appear in the check 2 Fridays from now. It is not a bad number. You put the arithmetic away. The bus moves. Outside the window, the city is doing what cities do in the evening, filling up with people who have finished with one thing and on their way to another, everyone carrying the day home with them in the various ways that people carry things. Tomorrow morning you will arrive at 7:45 and set up the counter in 22 minutes, and the doors will open at 9 and there will be a Tuesday in October, which will be a Wednesday, and the women will come and some of them will buy things and some of them will try things and some of them will just stop for a few minutes because they liked the way the place smelled when they walked by, and you will be there, in your white coat, with your customer book in your locker and your notes from the day before, ready to pay attention to whoever arrives. This is the job. It is skilled work. It is undervalued work. It is work that a significant number of people have never thought about carefully enough to know either of those things. You know them. You do it anyway. You are good at it. That combination is more common than it is credited, and it is worth something, which is a sentence that this particular era was not very good at saying out loud about the kind of work that the particular kind of woman doing it was doing. The department store salesgirl's experience of the institution she worked for was also shaped by something that is harder to quantify than wages or commission structures, which is the social texture of the floor itself, the daily experience of being a woman in a particular role in a particular kind of workplace, and what that experience accumulated into over months and years of daily repetition. The floor had a social life. There were friendships, there were hierarchies, there were the small politics of who got which counter, which department, which supervisor, and the ways those small politics intersected with the larger ones about who got promoted and who did not, and what the criteria for promotion were and how transparent those criteria were in practice versus in theory. The hierarchy on the floor was organised formally by department and supervisory role, and informally by seniority and skill, and by the kinds of social ease that are distributed unevenly in any workplace. The women who are confident and articulate, and whose presence projected a competence that others read as authority, and the women who had equally good skills but whose presentation was less immediately legible as managerial, and the way those two categories did not always match up with who actually knew more or who could actually do the job better. The cosmetics department had a supervisor who reported to the floor manager, who reported to someone further up the organisational structure, and the supervisor's authority over the saleswomen was real in terms of scheduling and performance review, and in the less formal dimension of daily working conditions, which could be made more or less pleasant by a supervisor's disposition. Good supervisors existed. The department store system, for all its structural problems, produced supervisors who understood the work their saleswomen were doing, and respected it, and ran their departments in ways that acknowledged skill and rewarded it, at least within the limits of what the compensation structure permitted. Bad supervisors also existed, as they exist everywhere, and the specific pathology of the bad cosmetics department supervisor was often a particular kind of territorial anxiety about the customer relationships that the more skilled saleswomen had developed, because a saleswoman with a loyal customer base was in some sense independent of the supervisor's validation, in a way that a newer employee was not. The customer who asked for a specific saleswoman by name was expressing a preference that the floor could not easily override, and that preference was a form of power, small and specific but real. The physical toll of the work was one of the things that the job's public image consistently underrepresented. A saleswoman standing behind a counter for 9 hours on a hard floor was doing something physically demanding that the white coat and the pleasant surroundings and the social nature of the interaction made easy to overlook as labour. It was labour. The feet knew it. The lower back knew it. The woman who arrived home at 5:30 and took off her shoes at the door and sat in the first available chair was expressing something accurate about what the day had cost her body, a cost that did not appear in any job description and was not compensated in any formal way, and that accumulated over years of this work into a kind of bodily knowledge of what her particular profession required, which was considerably more than any outsider looking at the glossy image of the salesgirl in the white coat would have been likely to estimate. The white coat itself was a complex object. It was a uniform, which meant it served the practical purpose of standardizing the appearance of the department's employees, creating a visual consistency that the customer experience depended on and that the companies paying for counter space insisted upon. It was also a symbol carrying the authority of medicine and science and the suggestion of expertise, which was exactly what the cosmetics companies wanted it to carry, because the suggestion of expertise made the recommendations of the women wearing it seem more credible and more worth paying for. It was also, for the women wearing it, a kind of protective costume, a professional identity that existed alongside their personal one, and that they could, to some degree, put on and take off at the beginning and end of the working day. This protective quality was real and was valued. The white coat was the thing you were wearing when a difficult customer was rude, and the difficulty of being rude to someone in a white coat was slightly greater than the difficulty of being rude to someone in ordinary clothes because the authority the white coat signified demanded a response, however minimal, before the rudeness could proceed. The white coat was also the thing that said, "This is who I am in this space, and this is what I know, and this is my right to be here." And that saying was meaningful in a world where women's professional authority was frequently questioned, and where the physical space of the department store, however welcoming its marketing, was actually organised around the authority of male managers and corporate decision-makers, and the compliance of female employees who could be replaced relatively easily if they were troublesome. The relationship between the saleswomen and the women they served was one of the things that made the job worth doing, in the accounting of many women who did it. The customer who came back, who asked for you, who brought a friend who'd heard about you, who remembered you clearly enough after 3 months to resume a conversation that had been interrupted by a quarter year of ordinary life, that customer was something beyond a commission. She was evidence of a skill that you had developed and that was producing results, and the evidence was in the form of a person who chose your company, which is one of the better forms that evidence can take. The women who worked cosmetics counters for years, who built the loyal customer bases that their customer books recorded, experienced something in those relationships that the job's official description as retail sales did not fully capture. It was more like a practice in the sense that a doctor has a practice, a body of long-term relationships organised around a specific form of knowledge and care, except that the practice was commercially motivated and the care was also a sales technique, and the knowledge was in service of selling products rather than treating illness. The distinctions do not resolve neatly. The care was real, the sale was real, the knowledge was real, the commercial motivation was real. All of them were operating simultaneously, which is uncomfortable to hold if you need things to be simply one thing, but which is the actual texture of skilled service work, in this era and in every era, the way that the genuinely good doctor also makes a living from medicine, and the way that making a living from something does not automatically compromise what is genuine in it, and the way that what is genuine in it can coexist with the commercial structure without being destroyed by it. What was being asked of the women behind those counters was a specific kind of professional performance that had no real training program, no certification, no official acknowledgement as a skill. It was learned by doing and refined by watching, and transmitted informally among women who shared a floor, and the transmission was imperfect in the way that all informal transmission is imperfect. But it was also resilient, because the thing being transmitted was not a set of rules but a sensibility, a way of paying attention and responding to what you found. And that sensibility survived the lack of formal documentation, because it was grounded in something more fundamental than any document could capture, which was the direct human experience of being on the same floor with the same customers day after day, and learning from that direct experience what actually worked and what did not. The women who did this work in the 1960s are in their 80s and 90s now, the ones who are still alive, and they carry the history of it in their bodies and their memories in ways that no archive preserves, because the archive of daily work is the people who did it, and when they are gone, the archive is gone with them. What persists is the official image, the photographs, and the advertisements, and the magazine spreads, and the official image, as we have been noting all evening, is not the whole story. The whole story is the customer book in the locker. The whole story is the shoes changed at the door. The whole story is the woman who knew after 14 months exactly which tester lipsticks were in the wrong position and had decided not to say anything because saying it would require more effort than the situation warranted, and who made that decision with a practical intelligence that was never photographed and never archived. And that was, in its quiet way, as characteristic of her particular time and place as anything the official image contains. There is a moment at the end of every account of the department store, every magazine photograph of the glittering first floor, every advertisement for products sold behind glass cases on marble floors, where the image does a very specific kind of work. It shows you the surface and implies, through the beauty of the surface and the care with which it has been composed, that the surface is the whole thing, that the marble floors and the flattering lights, and the confident saleswomen in their white coats, and the women moving through it all with their pocketbooks on their arms and their lists in their pockets, represent a complete and honest picture of what the department store was. It does not tell you what was underneath the surface. It does not tell you about the people for whom the welcome was incomplete, or the systems that operated inside the cheerful image with a quiet force that the cheerful image was specifically designed to keep invisible. The image was beautiful. The image was also a construction, and the gap between the construction and the full reality is worth spending some time inside, because the gap is where the actual texture of the era lives, the texture that the magazines and the advertisements had no incentive to show and every incentive to smooth over. The first thing worth understanding about the department store in the post-war era is that its physical location was itself a form of argument about who was welcome. The great department stores of mid-century America were located in downtown commercial districts, in the centers of cities that had developed their commercial geography along lines that were shaped, from the beginning, by the racial and economic sorting that defined American urban life. The stores were not in neighborhoods where black families primarily lived. They were not in neighborhoods where recent immigrants had settled most densely. They were in the neighborhoods that had been established as the shopping neighborhoods by the previous generation, which was to say they were in the places where white middle-class families had always shopped, and the continued location of the stores in those places was a continuation of a tradition that was already a form of exclusion even before you got inside the door. When the post-war suburban shopping centres began to be built, the same logic applied in a new geography. The shopping centre required a car, or access to a car, to reach. Car ownership in post-war America was not evenly distributed. The communities that lacked access to the new shopping centres were, unsurprisingly, not random. They were the communities that the underlying economics and the underlying racial structure of American housing had already separated from the automobile economy. The department store's move to the suburbs was marketed as convenience, as modernization, as bringing the best of American consumer culture closer to the families who were building the post-war dream in their new houses on their new streets. What it was also doing, without saying so, was continuing the project of keeping the best of American consumer culture in places where a specific population had easiest access. Inside the stores, the selection continued in ways that were sometimes explicit and sometimes not, and the explicitness was most pronounced in the South, but was not limited to it. In department stores across the South, through the early 1960s, and in stores in other regions in less formal but still functionally effective ways, black women shopping encountered a specific set of policies that the store's advertising did not mention. The most significant of these involved clothing. In many stores, the policy was that a garment tried on by a black customer could not be returned to the rack for a white customer to try, which meant that in practice, a black woman who wished to try on a dress was either refused access to the fitting rooms, or informed that the dress was not available in her size, or that the fitting rooms were full, the specific words varying by the situation, and the individual saleswoman implementing the policy. The policy itself was rarely written, Ellie. It was understood. It was transmitted from one employee to another in the way that unwritten rules are transmitted, through tone and example, and the clear communication of what the store's management expected to happen and what it preferred not to have to address directly. The practical effect of this policy on a woman who wanted to buy a dress in a department store is worth sitting with for a moment. You cannot assess whether a garment fits correctly without trying it on. The evaluation of fit that happens in the hand, feeling the quality of the fabric and the weight of the lining, is not the same as the evaluation that happens on the body, where you discover whether the shoulders are set correctly and whether the waist allows for a breath and whether the hem falls at a flattering length. A woman who cannot try on clothing before purchasing it is being asked to make a financial decision without access to the information that decision requires, which is either going to result in purchases she cannot make or purchases she will need to return, and the return process in a store with these policies is its own form of difficulty. The policy was not random rudeness. It was a systematic disadvantage applied to a specific category of customer. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Producing a shopping experience that was more expensive, less accurate, and more likely to result in dissatisfaction than the experience provided to white customers doing the exact same thing in the exact same building. The cosmetics counter had its own version of the exclusion, which operated through the simpler mechanism of product availability. The major cosmetics companies of the post-war era, with the partial exception of a handful of brands founded specifically to serve black women, did not make foundation shades for darker skin. This was a business decision. The companies had identified their primary market as white women, which was a market large enough to support their growth targets, and they had made the calculation that the investment required to formulate, test, manufacture and distribute a product line with a significantly broader tonal range was not justified by the return they anticipated from the market they were not currently serving. This calculation was made by people who had the data on what it cost to develop new formulations, and did not have equally good data on the size of the underserved market, because the underserved market had not been studied with the same care, which is the way that business decisions about markets that have been structurally excluded tend to reproduce the exclusion, not through malice, but through the self-confirming logic of research that measures what it expects to find. The practical result was a cosmetics counter at which a woman with darker skin could not buy a foundation that matched her. She could buy mascara. She could buy lipstick in the shades that were available, which were the shades chosen for a different primary customer and which might or might not be flattering on her. She could buy the powder that the saleswoman recommended, which might be available in a slightly wider range than foundation because powder sat over foundation and the mismatch was considered less critical. What she could not do was buy a product designed for her specific skin, because no such product was available at this counter in this store. She was not told this directly. No one at the counter said we do not have what you need because we have decided not to make it. She simply found that the shade range ran from ivory to tan, which the industry called neutral, and she might have called something else, and that she was welcome to look, but there was nothing here for her. The response to this absence was not passive. The market that the major companies had decided was too expensive to serve had already developed its own solutions. Companies founded by black entrepreneurs for black customers had been operating since the early 20th century, most famously Madam C.J. Walker's Enterprises, which had established by the 19-teens that there was a significant and loyal market for beauty products designed specifically for black women's hair and skin. The Fuller Products Company, founded in Chicago in 1939 by S.B. Fuller, had developed a line of cosmetics including foundation shades for darker skin that was distributed through a door-to-door network that reached communities the department store cosmetics counter did not serve and was not trying to serve. Florrie Roberts, founded specifically to fill the department store gap, arrived in 1965 and would eventually become the first black-owned cosmetics line with distribution in major department stores, which was a correction of the original absence, but a correction that took until the mid-1960s to begin and decades more to be substantially completed. The lunchroom on the fourth floor was its own geography of welcome and exclusion. The department store tea room or lunchroom of the post-war era was a distinctive American institution, a place where the shopping day could be paused and refreshed, where women could sit down with their bags beside them and have a cup of tea or a bowl of tomato soup and a sandwich and feel for 30 minutes something that approached leisure, a pleasure that was real and that the department store was right to offer and that women valued greatly, which is one reason why the exclusion from it was so specifically damaging. You cannot remove someone from a pleasure that is genuinely pleasurable without the removal meaning something. The tea room was meant to be welcoming. The welcome was partial. The partiality was a statement made without being stated about who the department store considered its full customer and who it considered something else. In southern department stores through the middle of the 1960s, the segregation of the lunchroom was explicit, enforced by the same management that enforced the fitting room policies, usually justified by appeal to local custom, and sometimes by appeal to law, though the law was itself the object of active challenge by the 1960s. The sit-ins at lunch counters and department store restaurants that began in 1960 in Greensboro and Nashville and across the South were a direct and deliberate confrontation with this specific geography of exclusion, the targeting of the department store lunch counter, specifically because the department store had built its identity around the idea of universal commercial welcome, and because the gap between that identity and the reality of the segregated lunchroom was not tolerable as a contradiction. The young men and women who sat at those lunch counters were pointing at the gap. They were saying that the image and the reality were not the same thing, that the marble floors and the flattering lights and the assurance of welcome that the store's whole commercial identity was built on were available selectively, and that the selectivity was not a small detail, but a foundational condition of who the store believed its customers to be. In the North and in cities outside the South, the exclusion from lunchrooms was less formal and in some stores non-existent, but in others operated through the management of service and space that produced the same functional result without the formal policy. A black woman who sat down at the lunchroom was served slowly. Her table was near the kitchen. The service that white customers received without noticing they were receiving it was absent in ways that were deniable individually and unmistakable in their cumulative effect. The store did not have a policy. The store simply had a practice, and the practice said what the policy was. The credit system extended the exclusion into the financial architecture of shopping itself in a way that operated on a broader population than racial lines alone. Store credit, the charge account that allowed a woman to purchase now and pay by the end of the month or in installments, was available from most major department stores and was considered an important amenity, a service that demonstrated the store's confidence in its customers and that made the department store accessible to women who could not always pay the full price of a purchase at the moment of purchase. The charge account was one of the mechanisms by which a woman could buy a $14.95 dress in October and not feel the full financial impact until November's account arrived. The process of obtaining a charge account required an application. The application asked for financial information, and the processing of that application, the decision about whether the applicant represented an acceptable credit risk, was made on criteria that were not published and were not consistent and were, in practice, shaped significantly by the applicant's relationship to a husband or male guarantor. A woman applying for credit in her own name, without reference to a husband's income or a husband's co-signature, found the process considerably more difficult than a married woman applying on her household's combined standing, regardless of the woman's own income, employment history, or demonstrated ability to pay her bills. A divorced woman found the application difficult. A widow found it difficult. A woman who had never married found it difficult. Not impossible in all cases, but difficult in a way that was specifically about her gender and her relationship to the male financial system, rather than about her actual creditworthiness. This was not a law. It was a practice, as so many of these things were. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act that would prohibit discrimination in lending on the basis of sex and marital status was not passed until 1974, which means that for the entire decade in which the 1960s department store was at its height of cultural prominence, the credit system it offered to women was a system that assumed women's financial standing was a function of their marital status rather than their own economic condition. A working woman with a steady income and no outstanding debts, who was not married, might find that her credit application produced a result that bore no logical relationship to her actual financial situation, because her actual financial situation was not what was being assessed. What was being assessed was her position within a system that defined financial reliability as a property of male sponsorship. The women who worked behind the counters and in the stockrooms and in the alterations department, and in every supporting role the department store required, experienced all of this from another angle. The retail workforce in department stores in the 1950s and 60s was predominantly female at the sales floor level and predominantly male at the management level, which was the standard distribution of the era across most industries, and which functioned exactly as such distributions function, by concentrating decision-making authority in the population that happens to be male. The women who ran the cosmetics departments, who made the day-to-day decisions about product placement and customer service and staff scheduling, were often called department managers, but were not always compensated or given the formal authority that the title implied. The buying decisions, the decisions about which lines to carry and which promotional offers to run, and how to negotiate with the cosmetics company's representatives, were frequently made by men higher in the organisational structure, who had less daily contact with the floor than the women nominally managing it. The wages paid to saleswomen in department stores in the early 1960s were low. This is a fact that requires the specific numbers to communicate its full character, because low is a relative word and the specific numbers are not relative. A saleswoman at a major department store in 1960 might earn in the range of $50 to $75 a week in base wages, before commission, which was a wage that required careful management to cover the costs of the job itself, the clothing standards the job demanded, the transportation to reach the building, the lunches that 30-minute break made it difficult to bring from home every day. The irony of being employed as a representative of a retail establishment in the business of selling women nice things, while yourself being a woman who could not easily afford the nice things the establishment sold, was not lost on the women in this position. It was, in many cases, simply lived with, because the alternatives had their own costs and the job had its genuine compensations, the social quality of the work, the skill of it, the relationships with returning customers who were something like friends, the sense of professional competence in a role that required real competence. The union presence in department store retail was uneven, and its history is complicated by the deliberate management of culture in many stores to produce identification with the institution over identification with the workforce as a collective. The retail, wholesale and department store union had organised workers in various cities, and had won contracts that improved wages and conditions in specific stores and regions. But the dominant culture of many department stores actively discouraged the sense of collective worker identity that union organisation requires. You were not a worker in a department store, you were a representative of the department store. Your identity as a professional, as someone who wore the right clothes and knew the right things and carried herself correctly, was tied to the store's identity, and the store's identity was not compatible with the kind of class analysis that undergirded labour organising. The women who wore those white coats were invested, most of them, in the image the white coat created, and the image was of a skilled professional who had something to offer, not of a member of a labouring class whose collective bargaining power was the mechanism by which she could address the conditions of her employment. This is not an indictment of the women who made this identification. The identification was real, and in many ways accurate. They were skilled professionals. They did have something to offer. The investment in that identity was a form of self-respect that the job's compensation structure did not adequately support, which is a gap that the identification helped bridge. But the gap was real, and the identification was, among other things, one of the mechanisms by which the store benefited from female workers whose investment in the store's prestige made them less likely to organise around their own economic interests in the most direct way available. All of this, every layer of it, was invisible in the official image. The official image was the marble floor, the perfume, the flattering light, the woman who belonged there moving through it with her pocketbook on her arm and her list in her pocket. The official image was the gleaming counters with their precisely arranged testers. The official image was the salesman's handbook's vision of the department store as a democratic institution where any woman who could make it through the doors was welcome to participate in the great American commercial project of living well. The official image was not a lie exactly. For many women, the welcome was genuine. The pleasure was real. The afternoon with the navy dress on the second floor and the thread in notions and the birthday card and the brief stop at the Revlon counter was a real pleasure that produced real value in a real person's real Tuesday morning, and the dismissal of that pleasure in the name of a systemic critique is its own form of dishonesty, the kind of dishonesty that reduces people to their structural positions and forgets that they were also, simultaneously, people living particular days that had particular textures and particular joys. The marble floors were cold under your feet in a way that eventually became fatigue and eventually pain, but they were also beautiful in the morning before the day got started. The light moving across them in a way that said something about permanence and intention and the value of doing things well. Both of these things were true. What the official image asked of you, persistently and with considerable resources devoted to the asking, was that you see only the first kind of truth, the beautiful first floor, the flattering mirrors, the world arranged for your pleasure. What it asked you not to see was the second kind, the conditions under which the beauty was produced and maintained, the people for whom the welcome was partial, the financial architecture that made the democratic promise of the charge account available to some women and not to others, the women behind the counters on their tired feet calculating their commissions and managing their customer books, with a professionalism that the institution they were serving had never formally acknowledged with either adequate pay or adequate respect. What is interesting in retrospect is how many of the women inside this system saw both kinds of truth simultaneously. The shopper who knew about the flattering mirrors and came anyway because the mirrors were genuinely pleasant. The saleswoman who was invested in the identity of the white coat and also knew exactly what her commission statement said and what it implied about her economic standing. The customer who could not try on the dress and found another way to get the dress or did not get the dress, and noted the reason with a clarity that the store preferred not to have noted. The women of this era were not naive. They were navigating a system that had been designed with their participation in mind, but not always with their interests at heart, and the navigation required a continuous low-level intelligence that was one of the era's most common and most overlooked kinds of skill. The department store as an institution peaked in the 1960s and had already begun its slow decline by the early 1970s, though the decline was not visible yet in the same way that declines are never fully visible until they are far enough along to be named. The discount retail revolution, already begun by stores like Kmart and Walmart that were expanding through the suburbs at the edges of the department store's geography, was offering the same kinds of goods at significantly lower prices in environments that made no claims to marble floors or atmospheric perfume. The women who'd been buying dresses at $14.95 would find, in the years ahead, that they could buy a similar dress for less elsewhere, and the question of whether the experience of the department store was worth the price premium was a question that more and more women would answer differently as the decade turned. What was lost in the decline, along with the things that were genuinely worth losing, was something harder to replace, which was the specific social geography of the place, the way the department store had functioned as a meeting ground, a shared public space with an implicit common culture, where women from different streets and different circumstances shared a floor and a set of common experiences, the marble underfoot, the perfume in the air, the conversation at the counter that might go anywhere. The social function of the department store was real, and it was not entirely replaceable by a discount retail experience in a building with fluorescent lights and concrete floors, and the loss of it has been mourned in various forms, usually in the form of nostalgia for a specific store in a specific city that closed in a specific year, by people who remember not just the products, but the feeling of the place, the specific combination of qualities that made the department store something more than a place to buy thread and a birthday card, or at least something that felt like more, and whose feeling was worth something even when you knew all the ways in which the feeling was partly manufactured. The feeling and the system it was manufactured to serve, both of them true, both of them part of the full account, and the women who moved through it, all of them, the shoppers and the saleswomen, and the women who could not try on the dress and the women who could not get the charge account, and the woman who made the moisturizer for 30 years, and the woman who stood behind her counter for 9 hours and wrote carefully in her customer book. All of them were doing something that was simultaneously shaped by the system and also irreducible to it. They were living their particular days. They were navigating their particular situations with the particular resources available to them. They were, in the ways that people always are, more than what the institutions around them required or permitted or imagined. And that, finally, is the thing worth remembering when the official image has been examined and the gap between the image and the reality has been named honestly and the full account has been kept. The people inside it were real. The people inside it were managing. The people inside it were, quietly and without announcement and with a skill that rarely made it into the historical record, doing what people have always done in imperfect systems, which is finding the small spaces of genuine pleasure and genuine skill and genuine connection, and living in those spaces as fully as the surrounding conditions allowed. And that is where we rest tonight, with the full account. Not the official image alone, and not its critique alone either, but both of them together, held honestly, the way you hold a thing that is complicated and does not resolve into something simple without losing something true. The marble floors and the flattering mirrors and the atmospheric perfume, the partial welcome and the credit application that asked the wrong question. The woman with her customer book in her locker and her practical intelligence about the planogram and the deep, genuine skill in how she looked at a face and gave it what it needed. All of it together. All of it part of the same Tuesday morning in October, in the same mid-century American city, where ordinary life was being lived by real people with real competencies and real constraints and the full range of human experience that no official image was ever designed to capture, and that survives the official image every time, because people are more than any image made of them. We began this evening in the body of a woman pushing through a glass door and adjusting to the air inside. We felt what she felt. The marble underfoot, the perfume, the weight of the pocketbook on her arm, the practiced eye that sorted through the rack and found the navy wool crepe behind the unfortunate orange and knew immediately that it fit at the shoulders, which was the hard part, and needed half an inch at the side seams, which was not. The considered restraint that put the dress back on the hanger and noted its position for possible return in 3 days. The thread chosen by eye against a swatch, carried in the pocket for exactly this purpose. The birthday card chosen with knowledge of a specific woman's specific sensibility about sentiment. None of this was dramatic. All of it was skilled. The skill of managing a life inside a specific set of material and cultural conditions, taking from what was available, what was genuinely useful, and leaving behind what was not, with a practical clarity that did not require announcing itself because it was simply how you got through the morning and got home with what you actually needed. We moved from her morning into the story of the woman who built the world she moved through, the immigrant's daughter from Queens who understood something about what women needed that the established industry had not yet put into words, which is that the thing they were buying was not a product but an experience of being attended to, of having their faces taken seriously by someone who knew what they were looking at. Estee Lauder sold face cream. She also sold the feeling that you were worth the attention of an expert, that your particular face was specific enough to deserve a specific response, that the counter was not a machine for processing customers, but a place where someone would look at you clearly and tell you what they saw. She was right that women wanted this. She was right that they would pay for it if it was offered well. She spent 60 years offering it well, and the empire she built is still offering it, with the same gift with purchase and the same application technique and the same fundamental commercial intelligence about what the transaction was actually about. We followed the saleswoman through a full working day that began before the marble floors were full of people and ended when she changed her shoes at the door at home and sat down in the first available chair. We saw the customer book and the planogram and the commission calculation at the end of the day. We saw the skill of the 2:30 customer, the spring wedding mother, the search for the right red that would read well in afternoon church light in May. We saw how the skill of being a good saleswoman was also the skill of being genuinely interested in the particular woman in front of you, of treating her situation as specific rather than generic, of giving her more than she came for in the form of information and attention even when the commercial outcome was not guaranteed. The skill was real, the work was demanding, the compensation was insufficient. The connections that the work made possible were, for many of the women who did it, one of the things that made it worth doing anyway. We looked, finally, at what the official image was built to keep you from examining, the partial welcome, the fitting rooms and the charge accounts, and the foundation shades that did not exist for the woman the company had decided was not worth formulating for. The sit-in at the lunch counter, the wages that required you to dress for a job that the wages could not comfortably support, the planogram that came from New York and was followed, mostly, even when the woman following it knew more about her particular counter than any planogram committee could know, because the organizational structure asked for compliance, and she had made the practical calculation that compliance was the right response to this particular situation. None of this cancels the pleasure. The pleasure was real. The marble was cold and beautiful both. The youth dew was genuinely a lovely fragrance. The afternoon at the cosmetics counter with the spring wedding mother was a genuine human exchange in which something was accomplished that deserved the name of care, even inside the commercial structure that framed and motivated it. The woman who found the thread on the third spool and recognized it, with the practiced certainty of long experience, was doing something that deserved the name of skill, even in the absence of any formal acknowledgement of it as such. These things happened. They were part of the era, and part of the life, and part of the full account, which is what we have been trying to keep this evening. What strikes me, sitting with all of it as the night goes on, is the consistency of the human project inside the varying conditions. Every era asks its people to navigate systems that were not designed entirely in their interest, systems that have their own logic and their own momentum, and that require of the people inside them a continuous series of small negotiations between what the system offers and what the people within it actually need. The 1960s American woman in the department store was negotiating. The saleswoman in the white coat was negotiating. The woman who could not get the charge account was negotiating in a different and harder way. All of them were bringing their particular intelligence and their particular resources to the particular system they had been given to work with, and the results of those negotiations were not just commercial outcomes, but the texture of actual lives, actual Tuesdays, actual pleasures and fatigues and small victories and considerable indignities. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. What they left behind is partly the record and partly the absence of record. The photographs show the marble floors, they show the counters and the products and the women shopping. They show the saleswomen in their white coats, smiling with the professional warmth that was one of the era's significant unacknowledged skills. They do not show the customer books, the precise and specific and privately maintained records of 100 relationships that a woman built over years of paying careful attention. They do not show the tired feet changed at the door. They do not show the 3-day rule about the navy dress, or the swatch carried in the pocket for thread matching, or the quiet certainty of the woman who knew the third spool was right without knowing how she knew, and who did not need to know how she knew because the knowledge was sufficient and working correctly. What persists is what was never photographed: the intelligence in the practice of the ordinary, the accumulated competence in the daily navigation of a life, the genuine pleasure of a morning that went the way you intended and got you home with what you actually needed, the thread and the card and the idea of the dress, and yourself relatively intact, which is not nothing, which is in fact the whole project, and which the marble floors were there to support and not to obscure, though they sometimes did both, and the women who walked on them knew this and walked there anyway, because the warmth inside the doors was real, even if the welcome was partial, and partial warmth in October in a city that smells of bus exhaust and fallen leaves is still, in the end, warmth. It is late now. The bus has arrived and the October city has moved past the window, and someone is home with her shoes off, sitting down, with the thread on the table and the card still needing a stamp and the dress still on the second floor of a building she has already left. She will think about the dress for 3 days. She might go back for it. She might not. Either way, something was accomplished today that was worth accomplishing, and the accomplishing of it was done by someone who knew what she was doing, moving through a world that was beautiful and imperfect and hers to navigate in whatever manner seemed right. And she navigated it well, and she is sitting down, and the kitchen is quiet, and the day is folding. Let her rest. Let the October evening gather. Let the city outside the window do what cities do when the shoppers have gone home, and the stores have closed their marble-fronted doors, and the lights in the cosmetics counters have been dimmed until morning. Let it all be still. Everything was done today that needed doing. The thread is the right shade. The card says exactly what it should. The tea is going cool in the hand of a woman who's not thinking about anything particular, just sitting in the quiet of a life that is full and ordinary and, in all its ordinary fullness, completely, perfectly enough. Sleep well. And somewhere downtown the store is dark and locked, and the escalators have been switched off for the night. The machinery still, the marble floors holding the cold of the October air, the testers capped and the planogram intact and the customer books all locked in their various lockers, waiting for morning, when the employee's entrance opens again and the lights come up and the perfume begins to build from scratch, and another day arranges itself around the women who come through the door. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.